Napoleon Bonaparte sold Louisiana to the United States, but 58 years later, his nephew, Napoleon III, wanted to re-establish France's presence in North America by invading Mexico. If France were to succeed, they would get an ally or a puppet government in North America, strengthening France further. Historically, the war against Mexico lasted for 5.5 years, with it resulting in a French defeat. Had France won against Mexico, would they be able to get stronger and as a result defeat Prussia too? Let me show you what I came up with, and I bet you won't expect the ending of the video. I really mean it, you will not expect who will rule Mexico by the end of the video, so stay tuned. This is not the first time that France had intervened in Mexico. The war was officially called the Second French Intervention in Mexico. The first one happened in 1838, and it's also called the Pastry War. Let me tell you what happened, as context is needed so we can make France win the second time. Basically, the idea is that we make France win even harder this time. So, what happened and why did France invade the first time? The war happened because apparently Mexican soldiers raided a pastry shop in New Mexico and refused to pay, resulting in France to request money from Mexico. When the Mexican president refused to pay, France blockaded the Mexican ports and seized the city of Veracruz. In the end, France succeeded in all of their goals, so Mexico agreed to pay the sum that France requested. The thing is that Mexico never paid, so this led to France intervening again 23 years later, under Napoleon III. Had Mexico paid, the second intervention might never take place. To go right back to the alternate history part, my suggestion is that France requests most of the money right away. The amount owed to France was 600,000 pesos, or 3 million francs, which was a lot of money back in the day. I don't have a Mexican peso coin, but I have an American dollar. This is $1 from 1921, and it's 27 grams of 90% silver, so about 25 grams of pure silver. I'm showing you this coin because the Mexican peso is the exact same size and contains the exact same amount of silver. So you can see that France requested 600,000 of these coins, which results in 15,000 tons of pure silver. While this is a lot, Mexico can also pay with gold, government shares, or even sell equipment. At the time, a worker in New Mexico would earn only 1 peso per day, so if the whole capital worked for just one day, they could have paid France off, but they decided not to. As I said before, France would request this money right now, or Mexico would face even more consequences. France shouldn't just trust that Mexico will pay them and return their soldiers. The British and the Americans wouldn't support this, but considering that Mexico was an independent country for just 18 years, the idea of Mexico not paying back was possible. Here we have two options that would benefit France. The first option is for France to wait until Mexico pays, and as it wouldn't happen in the following weeks, the French would invade. This can allow France to declare war on Mexico and seize some cities and their industry, and use them as war reparations. Maybe France can gain economic rights or a protectorate over the Yucatan. This option could work, but there is only one problem. As the second French-Mexican War, which this video revolves around, happened only because Mexico didn't pay France the first time, by France invading Mexico, the second French-Mexican War would not happen. This would change quite a lot, so while this is an interesting option, I'll keep this idea for a future video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see what would happen had France invaded. The second option, which is the one we'll go for, is that France doesn't leave Veracruz and the Yucatan Peninsula until Mexico pays up. The mistake that France did historically is that they left Veracruz, returning it to the Mexicans, trusting that they would pay them. A good rule for negotiations is to keep Veracruz and return it once Mexico pays, so that they would have a reason to pay and not to default on their promises. So France would do just that and occupy these territories and return them to Mexico once the full amount is paid. The French also wouldn't like to wait around, so they would introduce some sort of monetary interest. This means that if Mexico waits too long to pay up the owed amount, it would increase over time, giving Mexico a reason to pay as soon as possible. The United Kingdom and the United States would approve of this peace deal, which is important as Britain brokered the historical peace deal. This move by France is brilliant, as it would financially screw Mexico over no matter if they pay immediately or not. In 1838, Mexico would have around the same population as my home country of Bulgaria has right now, which is a bit less than 7 million people. The nation would also be in the same year only 17 years old, so this would be a lot of pressure for such a young and small nation. After all, when Mexico gained their independence, there was a lot of fighting on who would take over. This problem would be present even after the conflict with France. I think it's fair to say that the Mexican government wouldn't be in a good position to pay the full amount initially, so they'll rack up interest on their payment. All of the other events after that would happen similarly to how they did in our timeline. This means that in 1848 France would suffer a revolution, in which the monarchy would be overthrown and the Second French Republic would be established. Napoleon III would run for president and win, and in 1851 he would coup the government and establish the Second French Empire. While in Mexico, the Mexicans at the same time would lose the Mexican-American War, with them losing around 25% of their territory, including the state of California. In this alternate timeline, Napoleon III's first action can be to intervene in Mexico and get his payment of 3 million francs. This would be a relatively easy task and would secure a lot of support from his people, which is important in his first days of being president of France. This action can also happen 3 years later, when he declares the Second French Empire, again to gather public support by winning an easy war. Let me tell you why historically France intervened, and how they were defeated, so you can understand how what we did in the First War changes the situation, and how France can come out on top. After Mexico lost their war to the United States, there was a lot of political crisis and even a 3-year-long civil war, called the Reform War. Benito Juarez came out on top, due to him being a liberal, which resulted in the United States to support him. All of this chaos in Mexico resulted in the Mexican debt to skyrocket. This meant that Mexico was taking a lot of money from France, Britain, the United States, Spain and Austria, without being able to pay it back. A pyramid scheme started where Mexico was taking loans just to repay their own loans. This couldn't be sustained for longer, so the payments to other countries stopped for 2 years, which made France, Spain and the United Kingdom meet to discuss possible intervention in Mexico, forcing them to pay their debts. They agreed that the 3 nations would jointly invade Mexico and force them to pay. Historically, France, however, had a different idea in mind. They wanted to expand the influence of the French Empire. As there were no places in Europe to conquer without risking a massive continental war, Mexico was a very convenient target. Maximilian I, an Austrian nobleman, was later put by France on the throne of Mexico in 1864, forming the Second Mexican Empire, but I'm getting ahead of myself a bit. So, going back to the invasion of Mexico, the 3 European nations landed in Veracruz, demanding payments and renouncing any claims on Mexico. The French, however, would now demand that Mexico also becomes a monarchy, with Maximilian I, the brother of Franz Joseph I, becoming the Mexican emperor. Britain and France didn't support this, so they signed a separate agreement with Mexico and returned to Europe, leaving France alone. The French started their offensive, taking some Mexican cities and advancing towards the Mexican capital of New Mexico. In Puebla, a city 100 kilometers or 60 miles from Mexico City, the Mexican army was able to hold out the French advances. This victory is still celebrated in Mexico, but had they failed, the road to Mexico was open. The French would soon inevitably capture Mexico City after more than a year of fighting. Now, France proclaimed the Second Mexican Empire, with Maximilian I becoming its first emperor. The United States of America issued a diplomatic objection, but considering that they were busy in their civil war, they couldn't do anything about it. Had Lincoln intervened, this could have resulted in a war with France, giving the Confederacy a better chance to win against the South. The problem in Mexico is that Maximilian was too liberal, which wasn't liked by the conservatives in Mexico. But the liberals didn't like him either, they saw him as a French puppet. When the United States finished with their civil war, they started smuggling weapons through the border, funding the liberals in Mexico, who would like to do a counter-revolution against Maximilian. In 1866, France withdrew from Mexico, as they realized that this was pointless and it couldn't work out. Maximilian was captured and sentenced to death by firing squad. His execution was special, as he pointed to his heart and said, "Aim well and aim right here." These are his famous last words. "I forgive everyone and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood, which is about to be spilled, and the bloodshed which has been experienced in my new motherland. Long live Mexico, long live its independence." He was shot right after that, with his body being returned to Austria. This finally ended the Second French intervention in Mexico. But as we all know, we can alter these events. Here we have 2 options on how things could have been changed. The first is my favorite, although it's a bit cheesy. If the speech of Maximilian I before he was executed provoked some emotion in you, you can assume that he did for the firing squad too. Now, I don't know if the speech was in Spanish or in German, but we can assume it was in German, but it would be translated to Spanish during the execution. This would make many tear up and refuse to eliminate him. A counter revolution can take place and Maximilian can come out on top. Of course, this is unrealistic, but it's an interesting concept to think about. The second option is for France not to send Maximilian as to become the Emperor of Mexico. Maximilian wasn't liked by the people, which resulted in his execution. A better alternative, which would also satisfy Austria, is Maximilian's youngest brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig of Austria, the father of Franz Ferdinand. Now, there is not a lot known about this guy, about Karl Ludwig I mean. He was supposed to become the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, but refused for some reason, letting his eldest son, Franz Ferdinand, to become the emperor later. In a way, had he not done that, World War I could be really different, or Karol Ludwig would have been assassinated in Sarajevo. Anyways, let's assume that Karol Ludwig accepts the position of Emperor of Mexico, with his vision to base Mexico on the Catholic principles. This way, if you oppose him, you oppose Catholicism, which was and still is big thing in Mexico. And since the Emperor is supposedly chosen by God, the people shouldn't get rid of him. All of this, I think, would secure better odds for the Second Mexican Empire. But let us not forget about the First French Intervention. France would occupy Veracruz and the Yucatan by the time of the Second French Intervention, unlike in our timeline. This would allow for more French soldiers to be stationed there, making the invasion easier. Under the Catholic faith, the Mexicans would accept their new emperor, with the liberals failing to gather support. The United States wouldn't like this change, but they wouldn't be able to do anything about it, as they just finished fighting their civil war. Maybe a trade war happens between France and the United States, with relations between the two nosediving. On the other hand, France can also do propaganda in the United States. They can proclaim that the same way how France liberated the Americans from the British, France is now liberating Mexicans from political instability, corruption and poverty. This may just succeed in securing the support of the American people, who would see the similarities between the two events. France and in turn Karol Ludwig would be here to stay. The port city of Veracruz would be officially returned to Mexico, but in practice it would still be occupied by the French. Similar situation would be in the Yucatan Peninsula. Again, let me remind you that these successes wouldn't be possible had France not gotten these lands in the first war against Mexico. Before the war, France was the third largest trading partner of Mexico, behind Britain and the United States. Now, with Mexico being a French puppet, the French would be the biggest trade partners of Mexico, making them more reliant on France. As for what will change in Mexico, I assume that nothing too drastic, but the Mexicans will get to enjoy some political stability, which rarely happens, as Mexico has suffered from the most civil wars in the continent of both Americas. Quality of life would generally improve, as Napoleon III historically improved France and Paris as a city, due to his many reforms. Similar reforms can be implemented in Mexico and Mexico City. The thing is that Prussia and France would end up being at war 3 years later, so Mexico can maybe join this conflict too. As a result, France would beat Prussia and annex Berlin. I'm kidding, of course. Mexico would do too little to change the outcome of the war, and once France is defeated and the French Empire is abolished, it would spell trouble for Mexico. Back in Mexico, there would be rebellions to get rid of the Mexican Empire, so Emperor Karol Ludwig had to do something. The reforms of Mexico would continue, with the swamps being cleared in Mexico City, and transportation being improved greatly. Since the overworld of Mexico, Napoleon III was defeated, Mexico would be a free nation. The Mexicans, I assume, would try to secure good relations with Spain and Austria, so even if there is an uprising in Mexico, these European countries can help to put it down. The economy of Mexico would subsequently improve due to more stability and the reforms I just mentioned. Historically, Central America was briefly united under the First Mexican Empire for a few years, before it broke away into its separate country and then into even smaller states. It's absolutely possible that for Karol Ludwig to secure domestic support, he would strive to expand his country's borders. There are no viable options except the small and weak Central American nations. Since these nations rebelled against Mexican rule, Karol Ludwig cannot just hope to annex and integrate them. He would need to play the diplomacy game and give them cheap loans and influence their politics. Soon, half of Guatemala and Honduras' economies and infrastructure would be owned by Mexican companies. In around 1880, I assume that both countries would be integrated into Mexico, but retain their autonomy. Mexico's constitution would change, with it becoming a constitutional monarchy, as to appease the people who are unhappy with an Austrian ruling Mexico. The country would now be called the Catholic Federation of Mexico, or maybe the United Mexican States. Either way, the idea is for more Central American nations to join. Nicaragua would also join, and El Salvador would be the last country to join, as Costa Rica would want to retain their independence, and Panama was until then part of Gran Colombia. Since Mexico would have access to the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, it makes it difficult to ship from one side of Mexico to the other, especially considering the lack of train infrastructure. Shipping through the ocean is pointless, as they would need to pass through all of South America, making it too costly. The idea of a canal would pop up in many minds. Emperor Karol Ludwig would promote this idea to the people, who would agree that this would create many jobs and generate a lot of revenue for Mexico, due to American ships also passing through the canal. Since Panama was not controlled by Mexico, the second best option is to build a canal through Nicaragua. Modern analysts have claimed that the Nicaraguan canal would be even more expensive than the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal costed $8.6 billion in today's money and took 10 years to build. This is not an absurd amount of money, as today Elon Musk has enough money to build 24 times the Panama Canal, but for the poor Mexico it would be a challenge. The government cannot hope to do this on their own, so they will create the Atlantic Pacific Transit Company, which would gather investments and carry out the building of the canal, and then collect revenue, distributing it among the investors. This scheme would succeed, and soon 20 kilometers or 12 miles of jungle would be terraformed, connecting the Pacific Ocean to Lake Nicaragua. Then, in the years leading up to the turn of the century, the San Jose River, located between Costa Rica and Nicaragua, would be extended to flow into the Atlantic Ocean. This is not to say that it would be easy. The construction can take 2 times longer than the Panama Canal and have many more casualties. The Americans would never even think about starting the construction of the Panama Canal, as this is a better opportunity for them. Historically, the Americans forced Colombia to give independence to Panama, just so the USA can build the Panama Canal, to which Colombia was opposed to. This should mean that Panama remains part of Colombia for the time being. Going back to Europe, France wouldn't change in any way regarding their intervention in Mexico, but the continent as a whole would have one massive change. The Mexican Emperor Karl Ludwig is the father of Franz Ferdinand, so Franz Ferdinand would be born in Mexico, and after Emperor Karl Ludwig would die in 1896, Franz Ferdinand would become the new Emperor of Mexico. Back in Europe, Austria-Hungary would still annex Bosnia, and there would still be Serbian revolutionaries there, but it is unlikely for there to be an assassination of an Austrian nobleman. This is because the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was absurd. The assassins missed their target and wounded some Austrian policemen. Then Franz Ferdinand went to the hospital to visit them, but his driver took a wrong turn and got him and his wife killed. The First World War, also known as the Great War, would still happen, but how it would spark up is a difficult question to answer. There is just too much unresolved issues on the continent, so another event could see the war starting, but maybe the sides would be altered. Italy was in a defensive alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, so if any country was attacked, they would all join their forces and respond. This in a way can result in a Central Powers Italy, if the conditions are right. Either way, Franz Ferdinand would rule Mexico, which is an ending I expect literally 0% of you would have guessed. I have introduced a new concept on my channel, this being the alternate history realism meter. Give this video a rating from 1 to 10 on how realistic you think it was, as I think all of these things that I outlined fundamentally make sense, and it's not too crazy or too unrealistic. I would also suggest that you check out this video next, where Russia restored Byzantium in 1790. Let me know the realism of that video too, as I'm curious what you think. Hope to see you there.